Ladies and gentlemen, in the spirit of the series with its emphasis on sustainability, Performance, the title, is going to focus on performance in terms of sustainability. But I should emphasize that in my head and every action as an architect, I in truth cannot separate performance in sustainability from performance in the aesthetic dimension. Call that beautiful, call it welcoming, call it human, the social agenda and the economic agenda. For me, it's a total fusion. So I start really with the first time that I stood on this platform, which was in 1959, with a measured drawing which received the silver medal at that time for measured drawing, and the huge sum of £100, which translated backwards was really a very considerable amount of money and did enable me to travel. I broke the convention at Manchester and concentrated on what would be perhaps later called by Bernard Rudolski, architecture without architects. I feel there are many lessons from humble, ordinary, wonderfully dignified, simple buildings. But whether it was my interest in the city at the same time, I'm always and still fascinated by the inner story of a building, and not just the building, what lies beneath the surface in terms of a city, an organization, whatever generates the need for a building, or the way in which a building is made. And later, as a student in 1961 in the United States, I became fascinated by another kind of simple barn, the kind of industrialized agricultural buildings here in Kansas, the Great Plains, the Midwest. And artists as visionaries and visionaries as visionaries also fascinate me. I live this work. It's positioned between our bedroom and our bathroom, so I pass it every day. And it's in a story, is that it's by John Gerard. And it's in a story is that Angelo Martinez, this worker, will arrive at this building, open it up, it's filled with oil sticks. And oil sticks are the kind of materials that Richard Serra would use to make his extraordinary black paintings on white paper. And this man is painting with these oil sticks this barn black. And the story behind that is that the agriculture which generates this building and which depends on oil is finite, it's peak production. This will run for 30 years. It's on real time and it's also imaginary time. It's based on a real building, it's in a real landscape, and it runs day and night, 24 hours. And when it's finally black and all the oil sticks are used up, and symbolically, peak oil, then it will expire, and the way of life that goes with it. Now that's a kind of interesting doomsday scenario. And the great energy debate is really quite interesting in some ways, in many ways, because certainly if oil and all the previous predictions have proved to be wrong about when it does peak. But the reality is that more coal and gas is being used than oil. And over the 200-year period since carbon started, going back to 1800, when the carbon to hydrogen ratio was something like 10 to 1, we're seeing a decarbonization even through fossil fuels. And that transfer to, in about 2100, predicted by then from fossil fuels, will be 90% hydrogen because the ratio has moved to 1 to 4. So essentially very clean, and it's quite interesting that with abundant coal and gas being much, much cleaner than oil, that the a lot of the, how can I say, a lot of the doomsday scenarios, I think, fall into question. It's an interesting debate, even the question of coal and India's commitment to power and electricity ambitiously for everybody by 2012. At least 2 power stations in June this year received carbon credits from the United Nations to the tune of something like £41 million. And even if in this debate you bring into account those green advocates, Stuart Brand of the Whole Earth Catalogue, and Lovelock of Gaia fame with their advocacy of nuclear, it becomes, I think, quite an interesting scenario. But if the whole issue of energy and renewables is in debate, I think it's quite mind-blowing to put that in the context of population density, and very, very clearly you can see in those areas of India, China, and the emerging economies in that region, the explosion not only of urbanization, whatever took 200 years in Europe, has been telescoped into something like 20 years, or at least several decades. And if we look at the birth rates, then again, the whole issue of energy becomes quite interesting, and it's impossible to separate the issue of energy, clean energy, from climate change. And I'm intrigued by the 2 visionary artists here, who obviously are in some debate themselves about whether it's going to be the paddy fields of London or the camel guards in the desert climate that might emerge. There's also a very interesting social imperative in terms of increasing the concentration of energy, the relationship between infant mortality and energy, dramatically lower in those economies which are energy intensive, and life expectancy dramatically higher in those areas of high energy consumption, and also birth rate in terms of those regions with low power, high fertility. So again, increasing in power could be a force to stabilize the world population. And likewise, the index of human development, a complex thing about education, emancipation, or indeed political freedom, all relate to the intensity of energy consumed by a society. So the very strong social, moral incentive for the distribution and availability of energy. It's interesting that on the diagram that I showed, that renewables are, at this point in time, so small that they don't make an impact on the diagram. But it is interesting to compare the various forms of renewable, taking on the extreme left a meter cube of water, dropping it 400 meters, a meter square of biomass, a meter square of photovoltaics, and a meter square of land occupied by wind turbines. And it is interesting to see that the photovoltaic story, if you had, as a result of the recession or whatever, the investment, the breakthroughs in terms of the efficiency and the economics, then it is far, far ahead of any other form of renewable energy source. And quite interestingly, obviously the wind turbine is a high performer in those offshore locations, in those countries which have the benefit of windy conditions. But in a rural environment or an urban environment, it is quite a relatively poor performer compared with solar panels. That's not in any way to criticize it, although I think there is a whole aspect of visual pollution which is rarely, I think, addressed in that equation. If we looked at the first column of literally dropping water here, a kilometre, to turn a turbine. And in this location in India, to essentially emancipate the young girls who are full-time occupied in the movement of transferring water. Once that electricity is generated, the water is pumped and power becomes available, then they become emancipated, they can be educated, they're at school, and information flows freely. Unfortunately, then a pattern of disenchantment sets in, because through that communication, they become aware that life is richer in all kinds of ways in the city, so it increases that move of urbanization, the transfer to the cities, where the wages are anything from 3 to 10 times as much as in a rural economy. We looked at a project, and I'm just going to put that project on the scale of Hyde Park. It is in a district of Mumbai, and in that imprint, we're looking at 175 hectares, around 1 million estimated, highest estimate, lowest is over 600,000, and a density of more than 5,000 people to the hectare. If I just go back to that, and you see the yellow fleck there, then that is that part of that suburb. And the ring at the top around the building identifies buildings that were built with the optimistic expectation of rehousing and resettling. And that is this building here. And it's empty. It's not used because the residents prefer where they are, because where they are works in a way that this doesn't work. So in the spirit of exploring in the community and trying to understand how it does work, then here's our team, that's Narinder and Chris, with the locals, and trying to understand what makes this community tick, what are the invisible forces behind the scenes, and why don't those buildings, those other buildings work. And in the course of that, they discover that essentially this is it's a recycling industry in this district, and it recycles 80% of Mumbai's waste, employs 250,000 people, has a huge turnover. And statistically, there's 1 WC to nearly 1,500 people. There are estimated 15,000 single-room factories. 90% is the black market economy. And by comparison with their rural equivalents, they're very, very highly paid. And just to briefly give some insights into what makes that neighborhood tick, here's one of Narinder's sketches at the top, and identifies that 30-foot road, 30-foot wide road is housing the kilns for one industry, which is making pots. And those pots are made, the clay is on site, and it moves through the home, live, work environment onto the street with the traffic, and that becomes the retail shop. And as you move across and you see the government schools which have been injected into that environment, and you realize also that the playgrounds and the railway tracks and the cemeteries are the only public open space in that very, very large community. And what exploring what lies behind the facades, how the activities overlap, how they work horizontally, how they work vertically, and discovering the people who make the brooms, who weave, and whose dependency is literally on the pedestrian crossroads. That led to the proposition of essentially something that was low-rise, walk up, and would provide with an enhanced quality of services in terms of sewage. It would not be open sewage, obviously. It would be a network below these pedestrian routes, which would respect and enhance the best qualities of the existing environment, but obviously significantly improving the standards of living. And here we see those individuals in terms of the traders, the weavers, the potters, and it also raised the proposition that one of the key elements in such an essentially very, very basic structure, which by its concentration would create a degree of open space in the community. And this was a model that would perhaps be able to be applied in phases, in stages. A key element might well be a sort of heart unit that would address the issues of sanitation, cooking, heating, and ventilation and cooling. And we took our inspiration from a unit that a research unit in the practice has been working on, which is a heart unit for not emerging economies, but very much a developed world, something that would use less energy, would be a prefabricated unit, could address the issues of heating, cooking, all the things which as separate units would cluster together to make one mass-produced, highly economical core unit, which would save energy, would save space, and would deliver a higher quality of service. And in the spirit of this extraordinary Tata Nano, which is a four-door car selling in India for £1,290, then what might be interesting is a version, the equivalent of that for an emerging economy as a heart unit. And I noticed earlier that in the series of speakers that the distinguished Indian architect Doshi also addressed the hall here. And I was quite encouraged by this image from one of Doshi's projects in the 1980s. And here, the foundations for a unit have been provided, and the equivalent of the heart unit are those boxes which, when you take the box away, reveals the heart, which is the sanitation, and also the kitchen, the basic essentials. And then emerging around that is this extraordinary, very, very vibrant community. And interestingly, just to the right, behind the trees, you can see that that vacant plot is waiting for somebody to do a self-build. It's a very, very small extract as an extraordinary, rich series of images of that community. The percentage of the population and the over 2 billion who live in the slums at the moment, and the proportion without sanitation, again, 2.5 billion, or a quarter of the world who don't have access to power as electricity, or even in terms of clean water, 1.1 billion. Adequate shelter is nearly 2 billion. And it's important, I think, to remember that it's only because of that that we, in our part of the world, are able to have the quality of life which the World Wildlife Fund would calculate would be in America something like 5 planets, and in Europe 3 planets. So it's a very interesting question about how, given all these debates about energy, population, changing quality, how we achieve a one planet existence. And it's really against that backdrop that I thought it might be interesting to share some of our reflections, observation, and experiences in the quest for sustainability. And obviously the imperative, and people have put it in different ways, but essentially the challenge is how to maintain the quality of life, to extend that quality of life across the planet. And obviously the challenge is doing more with less. And Buckminster Fuller, a mentor, a dear colleague for the last 12 years of his life, this is the autonomous house that we worked on together, the solar house. That was in 1982. I become much more involved through the exhibition of his work in the Ivory Gallery in Madrid, which I co-curated as an exhibition with Luis Fernandez Galeano. And in the process of that, has some extraordinary insights into this man who, in 1927, conceived the idea of a Zoom-mobile. And the Zoom-mobile would be an emancipating vehicle that curiously anticipated the Harrier jump jet of many years later. And he saw it, the air-deliverable Dymaxion house would enable, with the Zoom-mobile, you would travel in ground effect or you would fly. And in that sense, you would be liberated from the whole road system. It was very much, I think, that period which was the flight from the city, in the same way that the crisis, if you like, of an earlier crisis in the 1870s led to the flow to the city, the consolidation of the city. The depression of the 20s and 30s, very much away, and you could say historically the relationship of this crisis is noting a kind of re-emergence of the city. I think that there are certain cyclic forces perhaps there. As a consequence of that, I took the initiative of creating a fourth Dymaxion car, which coincided with a kind of 75th anniversary, because car number 3 was in 1935. And if this was, interestingly, Bucky had a friendship with Henry Ford, and the deal was that he could get any component with a 70% discount. So his car, which he did with a yacht designer called Starling Burgess, took the flathead V8, beloved of hot rod enthusiasts, and the transmission and gearbox of a 1932 Ford sedan, and literally put the engine at the back, the drive at the front, turned it through 180 degrees, kind of tiller steering at the back, and so it's a very interesting comparison between two cars because they share the commonality of the drivetrain. And it's always fascinating how the first of any series, any design classic, whether it's the 356 Porsche or whatever, this is car number 1. And it is extraordinarily even purer than the one that I showed earlier. And in the spirit of doing more with less, with the same components, Bucky got a car which was 3 times the volume. It had 50% increase in top speed, but significantly, at a time when there was no energy crisis, its fuel consumption was half of the Ford of the day. And in that sense, it anticipated the people carrier of today. So again, Bucky was always decades ahead. And I remember him talking about the analogy of doing more with less around the great Atlantic cable of the 19th century, and how that compared when the kind of satellite circling the globe, comparing something like 4,200 tons with 2.1 tons of that satellite, and then the familiar iPhone. So you're comparing 8 words a minute with something like 60 million. It's even more dramatic when you look at the computing power not that long ago, 1946, 30 tons. And this, again, the familiar iPad. And incredible comparisons in terms of operations per second, from hundreds to billions. Slightly different story in the world of some of my own more private passions, cycling. The comparison between the Tour de France in 1906, obviously more with less in the sense of lighter, more efficient bicycles. But really that's only accounting, according to one estimate, something like 12% of the difference. 88% of it is much more biological in the sense of techniques and drafting. And once a year, I cycle with colleagues significantly younger than I am, and the only way that I can keep up with them is that I'm in the body of the group behind, and the younger guys are at the front. And the consequence of that is I'm only using something like 2/3 of the energy that those at the front are using. And the same is true of another passion, which is cross-country skiing. And here we see in the Engadine Marathon, that formation is almost like birds migrating. And when the trail of this 42.5-kilometer race goes through a village, again, the way in which those architects without names created the micro-environments in the Engadine village is really fascinating, because the wind evaporates, and it's because of the way in which the houses cluster and the asymmetric routes which work with the elements in the same way that the Engadine house is very special. Thick insulating walls, tiny windows, and then sculpted in to maximize the amount of light which will go into the interior. And again, it's no accident that Le Corbusier loved this area and absorbed it and sketched it. And I think the results in terms of Ronchamp, that connection is very evident. Another passion is flight and aviation. And if you imagine a rising current of air marked by a kind of fluffy white cloud at the top, and the glider thermals, it circles in that. And on one occasion, I remember a huge bird being at the opposite side of the circle and looking at each other and sizing each other up. And I became fascinated by the performance of birds and how you might compare the performance of a bird with a high-performance sailplane. And it is quite interesting, they both use essentially the same techniques, optimizing on the wind, tailwinds, gliding, thermaling, slope soaring, in a way a bird will seek the edge of a wave or the side of a ship to get uplift, flying in formation like the cross-country skiers and the cyclists, using their innate sense of meteorology to be able to sense the winds aloft. But interesting performance between the high performer of the birds, the albatross, and here you can see quite dramatically at the bottom that for 1 kilometer height, the albatross in still air will be able to cover something like 25 kilometers over the ground, whereas the high-performance sailplane is covering 60 kilometers. And the fuel is the tip there. So the glider and the bird are working with nature and the elements to minimize the amount of fuel for the journey, which in the case of the bird is flapping, and in the case of the glider is the aerotow, which will lift it to a certain height, let go of it, and then the sailplane is off for what, 2,000 miles? I don't know. I mean, the performances are quite remarkable. It is interesting to compare epic journeys by birds and the latest generation of 747s, although they're in the process of being overtaken. But for example, the bar-tailed godwit will fly in one hop from Alaska to New Zealand, a similar distance as the 747 from Tokyo to New York. They will both lumber off the end of their respective runways, laden with fuel. The bird will have consumed more than half its weight in the fat that it's stored up over that journey. Its navigation system will enable it to use its energy to penetrate crosswinds, to find high elevations where it will be able to take tailwinds. In the same way, the 747, with its huge intake of fuel, will be moving up and down in the air depending on the winds aloft and its weight as it consumes the fuel. And there's a very interesting diagram which manages, with great ingenuity, to compare the performance in terms of flight with tiny insects, with birds, and with man-made flying machines. And that as a trend line, as a measure of performance, also quite interestingly can identify other, how would I say, why would something that deviates from that, it would deviate from it if it was a special one-off, like Gossamer Condor, which is a pedaled aircraft and which would fly extremely slowly, kind of one-off. And also away from that trend line of optimum performance would be something like the Pteranodon, which as a kind of dinosaur was unable to adapt to climate change, and again is way, way off that performance line. In the same spirit, Concorde would be off that performance line. And that led to a curiosity about whether one could look back over a long period of time and find a way of measuring the performance in energy terms of our own projects. And so if we looked at a trend line, and going back to the 70s and the 80s, would be that line there against energy consumed going vertically, against the horizontal line, which is zero energy, and moving across on the bottom to the size of the project. And just being very, very selective for the purpose of this evening, just taking very, very few of the many examples which we have analyzed. And I say we've done it as architects. We've had to develop those facilities, that kind of know-how and the equipment to be able to do this, as I'll show in more detail later. And so if that was current practice in the 70s, and you compare that with good practice for air-conditioned buildings today, then in this scheme of things, where would Willis Faber fit? And interestingly, in terms of adaptability and going back in time, interestingly, that building was able to accommodate the shift when it came into being from typewriters to a short time afterwards, the whole information technology. And that thing about what lies behind the surface of the building that makes that possible. So if we took Willis Faber and we took Commerzbank, how do they look? Well, a fantastic performer in terms of the performance line, the trend line of its time. And in that sense, way, way ahead. And interestingly conceived 1973, and so many years later, nearly 40 years later, it is still, despite the technology of its time, it's still a better performer than the performance line of the day. And that is certainly true of Commerzbank. And if we moved away from the world of offices to public buildings and started to look at, for example, the Reichstag with its green agenda and the SAGE, and we look at the performance compared with the lines that define the standards in terms of existing public buildings and new public buildings, again, with energy generated by renewables, fairly outstanding performers. Now, over that period of time, we have evolved our own in-house standards, which are much more design-based. And depending on the relationship with the client, mindful of the fact that the architect is only as good as the architect's advocacy. So obviously, this is critically dependent on a dialogue with the client. On the Reichstag, it was a sympathetic ear, and the whole idea of a renewable energy concept was taken on board. But in our own approach, this far exceeds in its scope any of the standards called BREEAM or LEED or other names. And just looking at a little more at that in depth, the principles are that the environmental gain in terms of that bottom part of the triangle and moving upwards at greater degrees of comfort, that bottom part is about conservation, it's about passive design, it's the primary decisions, whether it's a building or whether it's the design of a city or a neighborhood, about the form, the massing, the orientation, the air movement, the enclosure, the shading, the installation. Moving up is then those other elements of active design, the management, if you like, the way in which the energy can be recycled from waste, the way in which the water can be conserved, treated, purified, the environmental systems, the internal configurations. And finally, it is those elements, and you can see the affinity here with the sailplane, with the albatross. It's working with the elements, it's working with nature, so that the minimum amount of energy is needed to be generated. Ideally, the building or the community will harvest its own energy, but whichever way, it is seeking to minimize that and at the same time minimize it and maximize the level of comfort. The level of comfort, again, in terms of performance. And if we look at our various projects around the world, you can see that based on our own internal criteria, that the accreditation by LEED, BREEAM, and others have followed, as it were, seamlessly from that. It's quite interesting to look at the regulations across the world, this one in terms of energy consumption. And I became aware of the vast differential in standards when I recently was asked to be involved with a prize in Switzerland for energy and architecture and building practice. And it's interesting that the differential between the standards there in terms of energy consumption, even more interesting when we move to this image and we look across the world down to China, Russia, America, and this is about levels of insulation. And the first reaction, of course, is to say, well, those countries at the top, they're Scandinavian, they're the colder countries in the world, and therefore their regulations are going to be more demanding. But that, of course, is not true, because you only give it a moment's contemplation, and you realize that, you know, China and Russia, there are places far, far colder than any of those Scandinavian equivalents. And I spent quite a lot of time on this on this award. I wasn't on the jury, with an independent jury, and there were 6 schemes. This little building on the left is generating 182% of its needs. In other words, it covers its own energy requirements, and there's an 82% surplus energy, enough to drive 3 or 4 electric cars for 12,000 kilometers annually, if you like. The average was 136%. So these are not zero energy buildings. They're actually generating energy and feeding it back. And of course, the relationship between the individual building and the mobility associated with buildings, that's responsible for the 70% or 80%, depending on your source, of energy consumed in terms of mobility, measured, in this case, on this graph, by gasoline consumed. And you can see that the higher the density as you move in my direction, the lower the energy consumed. So Detroit up there, which is sprawling, is consuming a huge amount of energy relative to Copenhagen. In actual fact, it is consuming 10 times the amount of energy, even though it's only half as dense. And Hong Kong, Manhattan at the other end of the scale. So I'll just be touching on some references to those cities. If we look at Copenhagen, very pedestrian friendly, dependence on the bicycle, and we move across to typical inner city and its related sprawling suburb, then the carbon footprint is a massive increase. In percentages, it's right up there to something like 5.25-fold increase in terms of carbon footprint. And many people have said this in different ways, whether they're urban economists, whether they're scientists, in terms of learning from the past, in terms of predicting the future. I was quite fascinated to discover that in 1900 there were more electric cars on the road of America than petrol cars. And I find it fascinating to go back in time, to the time of the Crystal Palace, a contemporary of Paxton over there, 1854. More recently, an architect in the fine print there described as Mr. Corbett in 1925, and both postulating visions of a city of the future with its layers below, which would create a great pedestrian domain and very discreetly serviced, and the mobility and the access and so on, and density. All very, very interesting in the context of, again, looking backwards. 1921, the number of streetcar systems, one electric trolley car for every 2,500 people in America. 80% of the US population used public transport. In 1950, a subsidiary of General Motors bought and burnt more than 100 electric traction systems in 45 cities. So really we're talking about 1950, the emergence of the car, suburbia, and all that follows from it. Notwithstanding the kind of iconic seduction, and I'm a great car fan, and I think that this guy, Roland Barthes, got it right. I think that in the pure form, these are incredibly beautiful objects, and this DS, I think, is certainly in that category. It's a small move from Gothic cathedrals to the graffiti on the wall that God has left Detroit, and the way in which Detroit is being reclaimed by nature. So in that sense, also would make an interesting parallel image to compare this with another part of America and the whole Google, Stanford University, Hewlett-Packard, Apple, and so on. But I think that's another meander. This is an interesting little event that happened earlier this year. A traffic jam that was 60 miles long, lasted 11 days, and it involved 10,000 trucks. And it seems to me that, that notwithstanding the emergence of the city and the questioning, I think quite rightly, of the suburban model as we know it, but the reality is that the car, I think, will morph into other things. The infrastructure of roads will not evaporate overnight. Change will not necessarily take place that quickly. So what might happen? Well, you could argue there's far more air around the planet than there are roads, but the reality is that since the explosion of air travel in 1950 and the development of the technology from the last war in terms of friend or foe and transponders and air routes, and the fact that these major routes are now the equivalent in the air of the autobahns, the motorways, and you have to have a special license, and you're under control. You are told at what speed to fly, where to turn. The computer comes into that. So it seems to me that there's a certain inevitability in the future that cars at least will be under control in certain road circumstances. And if you look at the technology in terms of GPS systems, and certainly the way that information is fed, then I think there's a certain inevitability that you will be able to make those arterial routes between cities infinitely safer, reduce congestion, at least increase the usage by 50%. And I was absolutely intrigued, having got this far yesterday, to look at the International Herald Tribune and to see that Google had got into this business, where they had 7 test cars driven 1,000 miles through cities without human intervention, and something like 140,000 miles with only occasional human control, absolutely the equivalent of the air traffic controller when you're flying on instruments, in instrument flight conditions, where you might have to intervene because perhaps there's a technical malfunction or whatever. And so I find it absolutely fascinating that this is predicted to be a major business in the future. In the spirit of how a lot of these threads might come together, I thought it would be interesting just to look at 2 projects which are, each in their own different ways, zero carbon projects. One is built and one is projected. And the, interestingly, seeds of both these schemes were set in an earlier project of ours in 1975. And this is almost like a mini Masdar. Has the fertilizer, it collects the rainwater, it desalinates the salt water, it has an anaerobic digester, it manages the waste, it turns the waste into energy. It has all the ingredients anticipated in that master plan for Gomera in the Canary Islands in 1975. And so here, in the context of this very bold infrastructure initiative in Hong Kong, very large site, incredible investment, many, many cultural venues. But the core of the thing, which fascinated me, far, far more beyond the potential for the individual freestanding emblematic buildings, was the actual urban quarter, the way in which you would grow the city of Hong Kong. And in that spirit of dissolving the architecture and the infrastructure, then where would that lead you? How would you analyze the essence of a city like Hong Kong? How could you recreate its DNA? And it was very much derived from a study of creating a main boulevard, a main axis. It was what you saw on red on the previous diagram. Influence here of Nathan Road, and then analyzing Nathan Road in terms of its signage, the retail face, the fields of cars, of people, and analyzing those in terms of quantum and percentage, and then working with those not in the abstract, but without the buildings, seeing to what extent one could conjecture spines of activity served. In the case, the one on the right is about cars and the movement of the people in yellow flowing upwards into the pedestrian domain above. And again, another visualization. Here the colors are absolutely constant. The purple is the retail frontage, the red are the signs, the yellow is the people. The buildings are not there, remembering that the traffic is segregated at the lower level. So some of these studies about how you add to a city, how you create a new city, and how you might retrofit an existing city to make it perform better. And here, looking at the layering of the city, the activities which take place one above the other, as well as the physical proportions. And then through that process, that leads to the creation, in this case, of the main artery, the avenue. But the dynamic of Hong Kong is also about the very narrow pedestrian street, very, very intense with a multiplicity of activities. And again, we took this particular street as one reference point, and here's Narinda's drawing, exploring what makes it tick behind the facades. Again, the layering as well as the density of those different fields. And that informing here the final proposition for that infrastructure, and the various stages in which you could reduce the carbon footprint and the creation of a great city park in a very, very dense city, which uses the species which you would find in nature. And again, in this instance, the 5,000 trees are doing their little part in that energy equation by eating up something like 1,350 tons of carbon per annum. And again, very much about the infrastructure. The infrastructure arguably being more important than the individual buildings which it glues together, because that is really about the quality of life in a city, the way that we move around it, the way that we experience those hard and soft spaces and the movement from one to the other. My colleagues can never understand why, when I make the switch from Hong Kong to Masdar, that I always find it important to bring these two friendly creatures in here. Well, there's a kind of rather slightly manipulated rationale behind it. The fact is that the camels have adapted to the desert conditions in the sense that their own temperature can move up and down, unlike humans. So literally, they are cooler than the desert, which is their environment, and they cluster together to improve their immediate environment. And again, if you compare the temperatures, the perceived radiant temperature in the desert there at 66 degrees centigrade, and a bit like the camels, what happened when you couldn't press a switch, when you couldn't have refrigerated air, when you didn't have endless cheap energy to be able to work the air conditioner? How in that world of architecture without architects did you modify the climate? And we've analyzed many traditional desert communities. And if you like, the first move is the orientation, creating the shaded street and a significant reduction in temperature from the desert there. And then courtyards and micro shading, again bringing it down 35, and then with greenery and water through evaporative cooling, reducing the temperature, making it more comfortable, and then eventually moving inside, additionally scooping the air. And these are traditional wind towers. You can see them on the left. And again, the flight analogy. If you're on an approach and there's a crosswind and you're offsetting for that drift and you land and there's no air movement, there's no wind. So you only have to go slight elevation to be able to capture a breeze. And these are our computer fluid dynamics done in-house, analyzing those traditional devices, hoping to learn enough to be able to recreate that in a new environment as one of the additional weapons to cool and create a more gentle, more higher quality outside environment. And of course, moving in with the insulation and those devices which create privacy and some extraordinarily beautiful traditional interior responses to that. And I guess that takes us to Abu Dhabi and Masdar, where we're looking at something like in the center of Abu Dhabi, with all its black asphalt, is significantly hotter than the desert which surrounds it. And those are very Western responses to that climate. Again, this is a study by our own team, in-house team, where we're trying to evaluate the performance of our buildings and our designs by going back afterwards and actually analyzing on the spot. And here you can see the different surface temperatures which give rise to a radiant temperature. That's what you feel. Notwithstanding the fact that the air temperature is 37 degrees, you feel it more than 10 degrees hotter because of the reflective surfaces and other elements which I'll come to. Now, we're coming to Masdar, and the drawings at the bottom are just a few glimpses, flavors for what the spaces are, and you can see below that podium the lower, rather like Hong Kong, the infrastructure which is servicing that, serving it, and liberating it to create a pedestrian domain. And it's very much a learning curve from those traditional environments. And again, in orientation important in terms of its relationship to north and south, the density there, moving across, and the way in which the car, the traditional car, is kept at bay on the edge of the development, the tram which moves through it, and in that sense you are always just a few minutes from the tram, and this personal transport system which you can call up, and within a few minutes you can use that. It's a kind of cross between a private car and a taxi. You have it to yourself, and it will take you the shortest route to your destination, and that provides the mobility within the development. So here you can see a cross-section, and you can see these small vehicles moving at the lower level. They're robots. They run on a magnetic system. Remember, it would be very difficult to make that work with a satellite system when it is actually at a lower level. Very, very different if it was in an external, outside environment where it could be arguably satellite controlled. A rich mix of activity, technical part, special economic zones, arts, culture, work, students, university, and a university which is totally devoted to research in renewable energy. Air movement, very, very important, and you're always within 1 minute of a square or 1 minute of a green park. And the green park is very, very important, not just as public space, but also to encourage the flow. So it's orientated towards those cool night winds and the hot day winds. And finally, if we extract out, you can see there the darker element on the left, and that is our first stage of 50,000 square meters. We're moving on now to another 75,000, and also committed through others another 90,000 square meters. So this is very much a rolling program, and just an insight into the process, the wind tunnel tests, the image of that in its environment, very much like a walled city surrounded by the gardens, which in a traditional city would be harvesting food. Here it is harvesting food, but it's also harvesting energy. It has the solar fields, which deliver 70% of the energy, the other 30% from the roofscapes. And in red there at the top you can see a reference to a 10 megawatt PV farm, and that is the 10 megawatt PV farm. The way in which the energy is provided is from this mix of different types of solar panels. One type, the 15%, generating the hot water on the roofs, for example. Concentrated solar power and photovoltaics, another. But this is probably as important, if not more important, than the whole of the Masdar project. Here we're looking at 12 pilot research projects, all of which are underway. They're all there, they're all performing, including a geothermal test well, which uses, interestingly, the technology of oil drilling. So because of the knowledge of drilling for oil and the temperatures down there, the expectation is that that will deliver a massive energy boost in terms of cooling by heat exchanging and converting the heat into a cooling capacity. But each one of these projects, a mega project in its own right. I mean, just to take one, the parabolic, the Fresnel one there, which will focus and concentrate the sun's rays onto a tube containing an oil, which will raise its temperature to something like 600 degrees centigrade, and that in turn generating steam, driving a turbine. It's completely cutting-edge experimental technology. And obviously, That's not the thing you can put on top of a roof. You don't want liquids pulsing above you at something like 600 degrees centigrade. So very, very much a learning curve. And here, the residential units of the university in place, informed by the work of an artist, Jean-Marc Castera, who we've been working with, who's an expert on Muslim architecture, geometries, mathematics, and so on. And here, the translation of those traditional patterns into the outer layering, which forms a kind of protective balcony to the student rooms behind. And also experiments in technology in terms of high-performance foils, very much derived from the space program there, and forming very, very beautiful air bubbles, highly insulating by their nature. And this is the enclosure to the laboratories for the Masdar Institute of Science and Technology. Here you can see the laboratories. There you see the way in which you can see the wind tower on the left there, retranslated from the traditional model. Here in a student room you can see the kind of brise soleil and the balcony in between space there. The way in which the rooms work, the manner in which these vehicles, which are there working, the individual trackless vehicles, the halls to the student accommodation, again a slightly higher transition temperature. And so if we look at this which is built, then we look at our kind of rendering of it, and remarkable similarity, of course, below this is the private transportation system. Our own team of environmental analysts have been out there lugging this equipment, checking the performance, checking the temperatures, seeing whether they were up to the predictions, up to the expectations. Are they better, worse? Are they good news, bad news? And here's one of our guys there, sitting in the shade. Symbolically, interestingly, he positions his feet towards the cooling, evaporative water there. And here we can actually measure and we can compare. And it's good news. The perceived temperature in that instance is 1 degree less than the air temperature. Here's another space. And what's the evaluation of that? Even better, the air temperature is 39 degrees, the radiant, the perceived, the felt temperature is 37 degrees. That is a temperature which takes into account the surface temperature, the humidity, the air movement, the surface temperature on one's own body directly. So it's what you feel in the space. And here, this is not a computer rendering, this is the little personal transport which will take up to 4 people going along its magnetic track. And interesting to compare it in the center of Abu Dhabi with a car engine, which is running lighter color there, very, very hot, people at 30, 40, comparing 55 degrees centigrade with 37 degrees there. And this is, I think, a very, very telling comparison, because this is measured. So the ground surface temperature in the center of Abu Dhabi is 57 degrees centigrade. It's 33 degrees centigrade. The perceived drop, how you feel it, is dramatic reduction from 52 to 37 degrees centigrade. Here it is at night, the key ingredients, the wind tower, the teaching laboratories, and the residential accommodation. Remember, you can see the podium clearly. Remember, you will never see it like this. This will be embedded in the heart of the city. It'll be surrounded on all sides by other buildings of the development. So where are we? It opens in a few weeks' time. It's developing 100% of its power on site. It's feeding 60% of that power back into the grid. Now, obviously, when this community expands, it will feed less and less back into the grid, because that surplus will also be driving, powering, lighting, generating for parts of the development still to come. Its power usage and water usage is between 51 and 54% of what is considered normal in the Emirates. So the design has reduced the consumption of those basic elements. All the sewage and the dry waste is processed on site and recycled. And so far, given the scale of this development, we've been able to treat the water, capture it for irrigation and for sanitation. We're waiting for the final approval so that it will flush the lavatories. That's still to come. But it's all in place, the piping is there. The geothermal pilot projects are progressing. It is, go back, what it's not doing is desalinating its own water yet. And that is because we discovered in the course of this process that the salt levels below the site were many times the salt levels in the nearby ocean. So it makes much more sense in energy terms to process that off-site. So it is work in progress, but I think it's a very, very unusual project, to say the least. And as far as I'm aware, there is no other research in the world at this level on these critical issues. Now, if Bucky conceived the car that I recreated, which was in a way a suburban model, his D45, which was the takeoff point for a car design which we have been working on as a research project for ourselves, is this small urban vehicle, which would be able to coexist alongside those robot vehicles which are currently running underneath Masdar. And a unit in the office, a small film unit, has brought together the proposition of this car, some of the thoughts that I've shared about the degree of automation in terms of very busy routes, and imagined a journey from this car from Dubai to Abu Dhabi. And hopefully, if I press this, the film will start to move. So it's moving off, and you'd be driving this car as you would expect to drive a car. You're in control. And you're moving around, you're moving in the direction of Abu Dhabi. And at some point, you're going to go on to autopilot. It's going to become semi-robotic. Of course, it could be feeding the driver information in terms of whether to accelerate, slow down. And in the spirit of the one version of the D45, which Bucky did for Kaiser, the rear wheel extends at speed when it moves from the urban mode to the intercity mode. And as it enters the city and it slows down and it needs to be much more maneuverable, then it shrinks, it compacts. Here it's going past our central market scheme. Very, very interesting project which seeks to kind of reinvent the souk in modern day terms and replace the traditional, what has become the traditional shopping mall. Back in the car, it's decided that it needs to go to Masdar, so it's programming itself, it's going along the road, it's moved out from the center, and here it's arriving at Masdar, as we can see. Unlike the other car, which is a traditional car, has to go into that blue zone, this is able to change its mode. It's now moving from satellite mode. It's locked into the magnetic system. So it's moving around in that undercroft, and it's coexisting with those existing cars. And it's moving into the induction charging bay, so automatically charge itself up. This is a real shot. This is not. It's very difficult to tell in this mix which is a computer animation and which is the real thing. Always mindful of the fact that the real thing is there. But of course, at the time that some of this was put together, the real thing was not there. So here we're moving down some of those streets, the shading, the orientation, they're cool, the barriers between inside and outside, the inspiration, the wind tower we saw there, knowledge center, we're moving in the knowledge center here, laboratories, offices, production areas for making new forms of cells, which probably have not even been invented yet, but which will be invented here in the life of the project. There we've had a kind of quick run through, we're pulling out, and we're moving towards the end of this snapshot of flavors of this living experiment. Thank you.